Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for participating in this class. For those of you I haven't had the chance to meet, my name is George Shardlow. I grew up a member of RLC, and my parents, John and Marilyn, and brother and sister-in-law, Ben and Kristen, continue to be members here. So it's a joy and a pleasure to have a chance to speak to you about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I studied public policy in grad school. I work in government relations and really will take any chance I can get to talk to people about the importance and the mechanics of voting. I'll offer two pieces of context. The first is that my presentation is meant to go hand in hand with the presentation of my stunning fiance, Madison Johnston, who presented last week on really the theological underpinnings of what we're talking about. And I talk about that a bit at the end, but the purpose of this presentation is really to focus on the nuts and bolts of voting. The second piece of context I'll provide is that the information in this presentation is Minnesota specific. States have some discretion around voter registration requirements and timelines and things like that. And so if you enjoy the presentation and you think I should pass this on to my cousin in Colorado or my colleague in Florida, you'll see I've included my contact information here, and feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help find information for those states. But again, much of what I cover will not be transferable. So I want to emphasize that this really is Minnesota specific. Before I get into the mechanics and the schedule of voting and all that, I do want to begin just by reviewing what we're voting on. The offices that we vote on, the issues that we vote on vary from year to year. So I first and foremost want to start by directing you to the following website. It's the Minnesota Secretary of State's website, and if you go to this address and you punch in your address in the lead up to either the primary election or then in the lead up to the general election, based on your precinct, it spits out a PDF that previews everything that will be on your ballot. So if you've ever gone into the voting booth and felt overwhelmed or caught off guard because there was a referendum you weren't anticipating, or you thought, what the heck is the Soil and Water Conservation District? I always recommend looking at your ballot in advance, and then you have time to research candidates and offices and questions and things like that. But there are a few things that we know will be on the ballot here in 2020. It is a presidential year. We elect a president every 4 years. We elect senators to 6-year terms, but the 100 U.S. senators are divided into 3 classes, Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, and they are elected on a staggered basis. So in any given election year, a third of the Senate is going to be up for election. And so the result of that for us as Minnesotans is within a 6-year period, 1 year we're going to be voting on our senior senator, 1 on our junior senator, and we're going to have 1 year where there's no Senate race on the ballot. It's a bit different this year. As you might recall, in 2018, both Senator Tina Smith and Senator Amy Klobuchar were on the ballot. That's because Senator Tina Smith had been appointed to fill out the duration of Al Franken's term. And so she's now going to be the only U.S. Senator on the Minnesota ballot because she's running for her first full 6-year term as a senator. The U.S. House goes up for election every 2 years. All 8 members of Minnesota's congressional delegation will be up for election or re-election. The kinds of issues that are covered at the federal level, the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. He, or hopefully at some point she, appoints the Secretary of State who executes U.S. Diplomacy. They appoint the heads of federal agencies who create regulations that govern employment law, environmental protections, and things like that. The Senate and the House, the U.S. Congress, they're going to be dealing with federal tax policy, crafting the laws that guide the regulation that the federal agencies put in place, and also some civil rights provisions. The Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, was a federal law that guarantees access for people with disabilities. We'll also be voting on state races, so there will be members of the Minnesota State Supreme Court that get elected. We also, similar to the U.S. Congress, we have a state house and a state senate. State house members are up every 2 years. State senators get elected to 4-year terms, usually, but again, as you may know, every 10 years the U.S. takes a census, we count all our citizens, and we redraw the legislative maps that both state and U.S. Reps and senators, senators represent states, so they're not affected by districts, but U.S. Reps, Minnesota representatives, and Minnesota senators then have to run in those updated maps. So all of that goes to say that in practice, state senators, if I, for example, ran in 2012, and then I ran again 2016, 2020, once the maps are redrawn, I would have to run again in 2022. So in any given 10-year period, there's a 2-year term and 2 4-year terms for state senators. And the only reason why I dwell on this topic is I want to give you a sense of the rhythm of some of these races, if this is new to you. So in the future, you can anticipate what elections are coming up. You can begin researching candidates in advance and hopefully run for office yourself at some point. State legislators, similar to federal legislators, these are individuals who craft state tax policy, state environmental regulations, state employment policies. They also appropriate funding for both higher ed, our public universities, and K through 12 education as well. And finally, we have local elections. I don't go into too much detail here because local elections obviously vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so I don't want to say something that's true in Roseville this year but not true in Lauderdale, or true in Baptist Heights but not Mounds View. But we can speak generally about the sorts of offices that we vote on and their purview as elected officials. So to begin with, we have county level elected officials. We elect commissioners to our county commission. County commissions are going to oversee things like social services. So for example, a lot of disability programs, money from the federal government goes directly to counties, and counties then administer housing and employment and some programs for people with disabilities. Counties also are involved in a lot of economic development projects. An example of that is Ramsey County's involvement in the TCAP project in Arden Hills, a redevelopment of a former armory. They also oversee county infrastructure, county highways and things like that. On the city level, you're going to have mayors, you're going to have city councils. They're going to oversee things like setting property taxes. They're going to be managing local infrastructure, city roads, things like that. And I do want to highlight, given recent events and given RLC's focus on racial justice, obviously the issue of policing has come up and come to the forefront in recent weeks. And certainly for Falcon Heights and Roseville in this community, even more broadly since the murder of Philando Castile. Mayors and city councils are going to be actively involved in overseeing specific police departments. The state, as you will have heard, is responsible for passing laws that govern the conduct of police officers, and certainly there are some federal laws that govern that as well. So those state and federal provisions are the guidelines, but that direct administration of police departments is going to happen at the local level. Last, but again, not least, school boards are going to oversee superintendents. They're going to be setting policy for curriculum and disciplinary actions as well. Again, I dwell on these things just so as you're preparing to vote and you're thinking about the issues that are top of mind for you this year, hopefully this helps think about which races you're going to want to spend the most time researching and maybe even, again, volunteering for some campaigns or hopefully running for office at one of these levels someday as well. So now that we have a sense of what we're voting on, what is the timeline for this? Again, I want to help you be able to anticipate the rhythm of these things, but I also want to cover this because 2020 is a unique year. We changed the structure for the first time in a while. Particularly, and this is specific to a presidential year, but in the past, many of you in either January or February of a presidential year will have participated in your precinct caucus. You would have gone to Roseville High School or another polling location on some frosty Tuesday night in the dead of winter and debated policy platforms for your party. And in years past, you would have passed a presidential preference ballot to give a sense of what you and other Minnesota Democrats or other Minnesota Republicans or Libertarians, what your preferences were, and that would inform who got endorsed to be your party's presidential nominee. But at those caucuses, you would have also elected your neighbors to be delegates. And those delegates would have actually gone to the convention to vote directly to endorse those candidates. And there would have been, there are conventions at the state Senate district level, the county, the state, and national that endorse at those levels. These caucuses have been and are administered directly by the parties. They're not run by a state agency. And they're still happening. But this year, 2020, for the first time in a while, we had a presidential primary in addition to our precinct caucuses. And so a primary is structured just like a general election. It's administered by the Minnesota Secretary of State. You don't have to show up at a set time. You don't have to sit through a meeting. Just 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. polls are open. You go and cast your ballot. Now, after that, we wind up with the results of those primaries. And in the case of Minnesota, the people who were elected delegates still go to their party's national convention, but they have an obligation when they're voting to nominate a candidate to vote in a way that represents the results of Minnesota's presidential primary. In other states, and I know this sounds wacky, but they have primaries, they have caucuses, but the delegates who go to the convention can essentially change their mind and don't have to be as faithful to the results of the primary or the caucus that their neighbors participated in. So again, this year this happened March 3rd. By that point, I don't believe President Trump had serious opposition, and then on the Democratic side, Joe Biden prevailed in the Minnesota primary. Again, separate from that, looping back to those precinct caucuses, as I said, those delegates go on to party conventions. Again, these are longer, structured meetings run by the parties, funded by the parties, organized by the parties. And at conventions, the parties, you'll notice the language I use, candidates are endorsed but not selected except with presidential candidates. So at the national convention, parties endorse a candidate, and that is final. That's the presidential nominee who will be on the November ballot. In the case of state candidates and local candidates in Minnesota, these meetings will endorse a candidate for each party, but if one of their challengers doesn't like the result of the convention, or if no candidate was able to garner enough support at the convention to secure an endorsement, then it goes to a state primary. And you're going, well, we already had the Minnesota primary. No, we already had the Minnesota presidential primary. This is the Minnesota state primary. It happens in August. And this year it's August 11th. And again, these are putting the state party convention nominations up to a vote with the population at large. With the presidential primary back in March, you had to request a ballot based on your party preference. You got a ballot that was specific to your party. In the August primary, as we vote to endorse, again, U.S. Senate, State House, again, if you go look at your sample ballot, there are columns for each party, and you are required to only to pick your party and only vote in the primary races for that one party. So you can't, even though they're all on the same ballot, you can't vote in the Democratic U.S. Senate primary and the Republican state Senate primary and kind of hop around. And if you do, that actually invalidates your ballot. So you're going to pick a party, you're going to stick to that column, and whoever from each respective party, whoever wins that primary for state office, for U.S. Senate, for U.S. House, for governor, that is final. That is who will appear on the November ballot representing their party. And finally, the general election this year, it's November 3rd. It's always the first Tuesday in November, and this is for keeps, right? This is the people who win this race go on to serve in those offices. That ballot is going to feature the party-endorsed candidates, as well as some nonpartisan races, some ballot referenda, and in certain years, state constitutional amendments as well. But again, if if this seems like a lot, when in doubt, go back to that sample ballot, take your time, research all the candidates, research all the questions on the ballot. So we know what we're voting on. We know what the rhythm is for when we vote. How do we vote? Well, if we want to vote, the first thing we're going to do is register to vote. You can now register to vote in a number of ways. For, I believe, the second election cycle, I think it started in 2018, you can now register online. So again, going to that mnvotes.org, clicking online registration, you'll submit a form. When we register to vote, we're saying two things. We're saying we are who we say we are, and we live where we say we live. So you'll have to provide name, address, and either driver's license number or some sort of identification to prove that to prove those things and that you're eligible to vote. You'll send that in online. You can also find paper applications, usually at your county election office. Sometimes, I believe Ramsey County Library will have a stack as well. So if you're more comfortable filling out that application on paper and mailing that in, you can do that. It usually takes the Secretary of State's office maybe a week or two to process that application, and then you'll receive a card in the mail verifying that you're now registered to vote. And if that's the case, you're free to just show up either to vote early or vote on election day, and they'll verify that you're on the voter roll, and you'll be good to go. If you run out of time, if it's under 2 weeks to go in the election, you don't want to risk having the Secretary of State's office take too long, and you're worried that you won't be officially registered by election day. Minnesota has same-day registration. So you can show up at your polling location on election day and apply to be registered to vote right there on the spot. To do that, you're going to need to either have a photo ID with your current address on it, or a photo ID with an old address in combination with a utility bill, a student loan bill, or something that does have your name and current address. You can also have a neighbor who is registered come with you to the polling location and vouch for you. Say, this is my neighbor, and I affirm again they are who they say they are. They live where they say they live, and that can also serve as a way to get registered. Although, kind of to state the obvious, if a neighbor asks you to do that, you want to make sure that they are in fact your neighbor and are eligible, because you don't want to participate in any sort of fraudulent activity. So then once you're registered, as I alluded to, you have the option to either vote early or vote on election day. If you're voting early, there are two ways to do that. You can do what's called in-person absentee. And so we've had this for a while now, for a long time, in light of the fact that we have U.S. service members stationed overseas, in light of the fact that people are sometimes traveling on election day, sometimes have to work on election day. For many years, you've been able to go into your county election office in the weeks leading up, I believe it's the 3 weeks preceding either the primary or the general election, and apply in person to vote absentee, and then fill out your ballot at the same time as that application. That application and ballot then gets stored securely until election night, and then your ballot, once it's verified, you are a registered voter, you are eligible, then your ballot is counted in combination with the ballots cast in person that day. This year we can also vote by mail, obviously just to acknowledge what's on everybody's mind. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. There are a lot of security concerns about what happens if we have a lot of people gathering together at polling locations. So again, if you go to mnvotes.org, you can apply to receive an absentee ballot. They'll mail it to you. You don't need an excuse. You don't need to verify any sort of need or any sort of medical condition. You can just apply as a citizen, as a voter. They'll mail it to you. You fill it out, and you'll mail it back. And as long as it's postmarked by election day, it will get counted and incorporated into the vote totals. A brief side note, if you're an election fanatic like me, the analysts are already saying that we might not know the results of a lot of elections on election night the way we normally would. Normally, media outlets will often project the winner based on the results that have been counted by, say, 10 p.m. that night. Now, because we anticipate there will be so many absentee ballots that need to be processed and counted as well, up and down the ballot, they're anticipating that we might not know the results of some of these elections until a few days after election night. In spite of the security concerns, there is something about voting on election day, and if you prefer to do that, again, look up your polling location on that mnvotes.org website. Many of you, I know, are longtime residents of this community, and you've probably been going to the same polling location for years and years and years. If that's the case, it's likely the same this year. It never hurts to check. But also, again, as I mentioned earlier, after the census, we're going to do redistricting, and oftentimes that is when polling locations sometimes change. So if your neighborhood gets pulled into a new district, you might be assigned to a new polling location. So definitely before the 2022 election with the new map, be sure to double check that your polling location is the same. Again, if you want to register same day, just remember to bring that documentation. And I will put in a plug, when you go to your polling location and somebody signs you in and directs you where to go, and at the end of the night counts the ballot, those are all your fellow citizens who stand up to be what are called election judges, and they're always looking for more help. So if you feel comfortable going out this year, again, you can find information on mnvotes.org about applying to be an election judge. So we've talked about what we're voting on, when we vote, how we vote, and I just want to close by sitting briefly with the question of why we vote. And for me, there are three basic components to that. First, I believe strongly in the idea of a civic vocation. We talk about that word vocation a lot in the context of the church. In terms of what is our role in the church, we talk about vocation in terms of a profession. I think citizen is also a vocation. It's a role. It's full of rights, but it's also full of obligations. And I think we really are obligated, each of us as citizens, to help govern this society, in this case by choosing the people who are going to represent us in the halls of power. And in some cases, I think many people quite rightly are frustrated with all the parties and all the options, and sometimes in those cases, there's a temptation to stay home. I still encourage you to show up, and if you hate everybody, just write in Mickey Mouse, because if you do stay home, there's no way for elected officials, there's no way for us, your neighbors and fellow citizens, to know that you stayed home because you were upset. It might just as likely be that you were apathetic. And so I think no matter how you're going to vote, and no matter how disaffected you feel, I think there's always value in showing up and registering your sentiments as a citizen of this republic. Again, why do we vote? We're called as Christians to be an active force for good in society. Martin Luther had that phrase, little Christ. We worship a Messiah who challenged both a religious establishment and a political establishment. Oftentimes he would butt heads with Pharisees who were religious officials, but ultimately he was put to death by Rome, by an empire that was threatened by the moral critique that he was offering. So if we're going to embody his gospel, if we're going to embody his love, I think that we need to seek out ways to be a force for good, a force for justice in society, and voting is one avenue for doing that. Lastly, and this is the one bit of kind of opining that I'll do, because I want this to be nonpartisan, objective, and just useful, but I will say that personally, I do believe in the separation of church and state, but what I would put to you today is that there's a difference between the separation of church and state and the separation of citizen and Christian. So yes, we do have secular, open, inclusive elections and government to provide people of all faiths an opportunity to help co-govern. But it would be foolish and unnecessary to think that when we step into the voting booth, we somehow cease to be Christians and are just citizens. Actually, I think the separation of church and state, the fact that we're not worried about some sort of human institution while we're voting, means that when you or I step into the voting booth, we close that curtain behind us, we are liberated to sit there in reflection and in conversation directly with our God about what our beliefs, what our values, what the gospel of Jesus Christ is calling us to do in terms of whether it's the environment, whether it's the economy, whether it's social issues. And so I think that, again, the fact that we have a separation of church and state should not lead us to believe that we somehow need to separate citizen and Christian. And finally, I'll close with this. Why do we vote? It's because so many have sacrificed so much, whether it's Gettysburg, whether it's the beaches of Normandy, the suffragettes at Seneca Falls, or those who endured acts of violence like the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. Many, many people have given so much to provide us with this opportunity, and unfortunately some of us still to this day encounter barriers to voting. But for those of us who do have the opportunity, it's a sign of respect to those who came before to make full use of that opportunity. And on the flip side of that coin, I think it's inherently a sign of disrespect to have that opportunity and choose not to make use of it. So the bottom line is please, please, please get out there and vote. Again, you see my name and my contact info up on the screen. Feel free to reach out with follow-up conversations, follow-up questions, and even just a general introduction. I would love to meet you and get to know you and be of service in any way I can in helping you feel prepared to vote both next week in the August primary and then this fall in the general election. Thank you.